Listo.
En Facebook ya está.
Ok. ¿También en YouTube? Y en Zoom también, ¿verdad o no?
Sí. En
Ok.
todos lados. YouTube tiene como un pequeño delay, pero ya
Entonces
está.
ya podemos comenzar.
Así es.
Ok. Hola, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a la séptima sesión del Seminario de Derecho y Sociedad que coorganiza el Colegio de México con el Colegio Nacional. Esta sesión la vamos a llevar en inglés, porque nuestro invitado va a dar su presentación en inglés, pero desde ahora quiero pedirles a todas las personas que estén en el público que pueden participar escribiendo sus preguntas en español, si así lo desean, y nosotros podemos traducirlas para nuestros invitados. Y ahora ya voy a cambiar a inglés. Okay, so welcome to the seventh session of the Seminar on Law and Society, organized by el Colegio de México and el Colegio Nacional. This session of the seminar was especially organized with el Colegio de México Center for International Studies in mind. And this is the reason why it is devoted to a pressing issue in the field of international relations today. And this issue is the question of the present and the future of the liberal world order. The question of whether we can talk, perhaps, as some people have argued, about the end of this international order. This is an especially salient topic today, as many of you know, because now it seems that this order is threatened both by the rise of illiberal powers internationally and by new nationalist political forces in a number of nations worldwide. That's why we're honored to have in today's session the participation of Professor John Ikenberry, who is not only one of the most influential scholars working in the field of international relations today, but has also written a series of fundamental works on the theory and practice of precisely this liberal order, on its history, its evolution, its crisis, and its future perspectives. Professor Ikenberry is Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, where he also co-directs Princeton Center for International Security Studies. Professor Ikenberry is the author of 8 books, and his most recent one is A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Crisis of Global Order, published by Yale University Press in 2020. And to discuss Professor Ikenberry's presentation, we're very happy to have the participation of Professor Mónica Serrano. Professor Mónica Serrano is a researcher at el Colegio de México Center for International Studies and a senior research associate of the Center for International Studies at Oxford University. Professor Serrano has written extensively on international security and the international relations of Latin America, with particular reference to human rights, security, transnational crime, and civil military relations. She's the author and editor of numerous publications, including Mexico's Security Failure, Collapse into Criminal Violence, and Human Rights Regimes in the Americas. So the format we're going to follow in this session is that first we're going to have Professor Ikenberry's presentation, then we'll have Professor Serrano's comment, and then we'll devote the rest of the time to questions from the audience. And so we encourage you to send us your questions using the chats on the video platforms, either Zoom, YouTube, or Facebook Live. And as I mentioned before, if you prefer, you can of course write your question in Spanish, and we can translate it for our panelists. So welcome, Professor Ikenberry, welcome, Professor Serrano. We're very happy to have you. And so we begin with Professor Ikenberry's presentation.
Thank you, Humberto, and thank you for your hosting and for my colleagues on the screen who are likewise have very kindly welcomed me to your seminar, and I look forward to having a discussion. So I will try to talk for 20 or 25 minutes to set the stage for a conversation. And I think what I want to talk about is the big picture of the international order and the liberal international order. What are its prospects? Where are we in the kind of world historical terms? I do think that where there's a lot of agreement today, at the beginning, is that the world order is in a kind of transitional moment, that we are watching if not a breakdown, a kind of a transition away from perhaps a troubled moment within the international order that really traces back to the end of World War II, the Western or US-led liberal order. There's something that has changed, and it was partly precipitated by the Trump administration's own quite shocking, quite extraordinary, quite upsetting attack really on the international order that the United States is invested in, kind of a self-destructive moment. But more broadly, across the world, there seems to be a kind of crisis of lost confidence in collective solutions to common problems, a kind of understanding that in one way or another, we are in it together, and that there is a continuing need for innovating new ways to cooperate, to solve problems that are not simply not going away, but that in many ways are cascading and growing more difficult and more dangerous with each passing moment. So we're at this kind of world historical moment when the most basic questions as scholars of international relations are forced to kind of go back to the first principles, the first most basic questions we ask as scholars, questions like what is the nature of international order? What are the sources of order? How does order come and how does order go? What about liberal democracy? We seem to be at a low moment, 15 years, according to Freedom House, where democracy has become less prominent. There's 15 years of what you might call regression away from liberal democracy, and not just steady regression, but the last several years has been a kind of acceleration of regression. What are the possibilities for liberal democracy to put their institutions back together again? Can capitalism and democracy be reconciled? Can all these basic dilemmas at the heart of liberal democracy, the tensions between liberty and equality, individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence, can these great principles that are bundled together in the liberal democratic world, can they be managed and brought back into balance? And for me, and this is what has driven my book writing, including my really a great year at Oxford at All Souls 2 years ago, was really the question of what is the future of liberal internationalism as a kind of way of thinking about the world and acting, liberal internationalism as one of the great traditions of thinking about world politics, along with political realism, along with Marxism or post-colonialism, liberal internationalism. What is the fate of this particular approach to international order, which is to say an approach organized around cooperative organization of the global system? Where can liberal internationalism today, amidst all this crisis, plant its flag? What is there a firm ground on which to rebuild the project? So my first move in my book is to take the long view, to take the view that we've been here before, that this is a centuries-long story that's unfolding, not just a 5-year story or a 10-year story. That liberal international order did not begin in 1989, nor did it really even begin in 1945, that it's a longer story. And the first move in my book really is to say that liberal internationalism it really emerged in the early 19th century with the rise of liberal democracies. And that over this 200-year period, there's been a story of unfolding, of waves of democratization and anti-democratization. There's been golden eras and catastrophes. There's been deep contestation. There have been close-run things. The historian Arthur Schlesinger at the end of the 20th century wrote in Foreign Affairs about democracy that really it survived the middle of the 20th century by the skin of its teeth. It was a close-run thing. There were only 7 democracies left in the world in 1939, and yet there was a kind of rebirth. So the first move is to take the long view and to realize that if you're a liberal internationalist, you're in a world that is very full of challenges that never go away, that you have to take a kind of what the Greek word agonistic, an agonistic view of the world, and not what was seemingly the liberal view after the end of the Cold War, which was a kind of triumphal view. So have a more sober, longer term view. And in particular, in writing this book, I was very taken by a book I read by the Columbia political historian Ira Katznelson, a book called Enlightenment and Desolation, where he looks at the generation of 1945, the internationalists, the liberals in various parts of the world, but including in the Western democracies, who had in their own lifetime been seen the kind of collapse of the global system, the Great Depression, the rise of totalitarianism, the rise of fascism, the rise of total war, the rise of the Holocaust, and the dropping of the atomic bomb, all in one generation. And yet, in 1945, the generation of 1945 liberals were not willing to say that that collapse meant that liberal open societies were impossible. They, in fact, rededicated themselves to trying to rethink how can you have open societies in a complex, ever more complex international system. So what I've tried to do is make the argument in my book and in my work, three broad steps that I would like to make. One is to try to convince you that liberal internationalism is a powerful way of looking at the world, that it has a certain kind of intellectual gravitas. It's been around for 200 years. It has evolved across the 19th and 20th century, but it is a respectable, resilient way of looking, equipping yourself intellectually to make sense of an ever more interdependent world. Secondly, to be honest with accomplishments and failures, that if you are a advocate of liberal international order as I am, I have to confront myself, and I'm sure questions will follow, that liberal order has had many failures, and it has been incomplete. It's tied itself with all sorts of mistakes, and one might even say imperial ambitions that have made it less than what you might say the vision, the deep vision might be. So make sense of the failures, be honest about them. And then thirdly, to try to pragmatically be constructive, that we are in the end of the second decade of the 21st century. This is going to be a very challenging century. There are problems that our parents and our grandparents never even could have conceived, problems that have to do with revolutions in technology and interdependence and the environment that are going to make open societies and open international order even more complicated. So I want to, in my book, make the case that if you want to survive the 21st century, we're going to need to recover some of the ideas and projects of the earlier generations to help us and equip us to talk about the future. Now, the next thing I want to say is, well, what is liberal internationalism? And of course, there is a kind of tradition here that often is associated with Woodrow Wilson, with earlier political leaders, with the League of Nations, with the United Nations. And what I argue in my book is that liberal internationalism is ultimately what liberal democracies have tried to do to organize the world they live in. So it's a more specific theoretical perspective than, say, realism or Marxism, which are in some sense theories for all times and all places, whereas liberal internationalism emerges really in the 19th century as a way of thinking about how should liberal democracies conduct their affairs. And so when I hear the phrase, and it's the phrase that is most famous, the most famous phrase for what liberal internationalism is, it's Woodrow Wilson, who actually was a Princeton professor. His name used to be on my school, although that name has been taken off. And we can talk about that if you want. He had a dark side that has to be said. He was a racist in certain ways. But his famous phrase was, was to make the world safe for democracy. That's what World War I was all about. And what I have in my book suggested, that phrase has been seen as a kind of idealistic crusade to intervene in countries and turn them into democracies and make them more like us, whereas that phrase can be read differently, more literally, as making the world safe for democracy, making the international order sufficiently protective of countries that want to be or are liberal democracies. And so my intellectual commitment is to think about liberal internationalism as a project for building a kind of environment, a kind of ecosystem, a kind of geopolitical space in which liberal democracies can exist. That is the central idea that carries across 200 years. When you boil everything down, that's what liberal internationalists and those states and groups that have taken up liberal internationalism, that's what they have sought to do. So think of liberal democracies as kind of precious flowers, as roses, or a type of fragile blossomed flower, and that the international order is in some sense like a greenhouse or like a terrarium or like a hothouse that allows for the environment to be regulated so these various flowers can remain in bloom. So international order is about lots of things, but it's about creating a framework so that liberal democracies can manage their vulnerabilities, can balance these trade-offs that I was mentioning earlier between equality and liberty, individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence, and of course, creating a kind of basis for managing interdependence. So another kind of final point about what liberal internationalism is, it can be defined as a set of convictions about the world, a set of assumptions, four in particular. One is that trade and exchange is good, and good for all societies if it's properly managed. So liberals think that trade is good, openness is good, exchange is good in one way or another, managed. Secondly, that rules and institutions can facilitate cooperation. Liberals believe that multilateralism can be useful to states. There are broad and sophisticated theories of institutions that liberals in the field of international relations have pioneered. And thirdly, that liberal democracies as a type of state have values and capacities to cooperate that are different than other countries. So they're, unlike realists, liberals think that the nature of the regime, the nature of the state matters. And liberal democracies are unusually capable of working with each other. That's the so-called democratic peace, that they tend not to go to war with each other, that they've tended to be on the same side of the great global conflicts, the world wars, for example. So there's something about liberal democracies that gives them a kind of solidarity, a kind of birds of a feather flock together kind of dynamic. And fourth, there's a conviction in the liberal international vision that under conditions of rising interdependence, economic interdependence, security interdependence, and environmental interdependence, that states are better off if they cooperate than if they go it alone. So one of my colleagues, Robert Cohane, who's a very famous scholar of international relations, at one point he put it in one sentence, really, the argument about cooperation, and the argument was, under conditions of rising interdependence, states are better off, or under conditions of rising interdependence, the cost of lost autonomy associated with making binding commitments is less than the benefits gained from coordination. So when you when you build institutions, you are in some sense accepting a cost of tying yourself to a set of commitments. That's costly. You aren't free. You've got to play by the rules. But in exchange for paying that price, you get a benefit. And the benefit is a more user-friendly world in which you can manage your interdependence. That's the fourth conviction of liberal internationalism. Now, my next set of comments go to this point about, well, what's happening today? Why have things not been getting better for liberal international order? Why are we in what many people call a crisis moment? And here I would start by saying that the United States has in some sense failed to act in a way that has been constructive. It has done lots of things that have been good, I would argue, but lots of things that are not so good. And I'll mention three things that have been kind of eroding or weakening the liberal international project, or more specifically, that have weakened internationalist elites in the United States and other countries that have tried to uphold the liberal order. The first is the Iraq War. The 2003 Iraq War was just devastating for the United States and for the liberal order. And let me be careful with how I argue this. I do not think that liberals were uniquely for the war. In fact, this is where I debate my old friend John Mearsheimer, who argues it was a liberal war, that the US was trying to turn Iraq into a democracy. That isn't what happened. It was really about what I call Beltway realists. Vice President Cheney and Secretary of State Rumsfeld, they were realists, what I call Beltway realists. They weren't academic realists, but they were there in attempting to put down Iraq because Iraq was challenging American regional hegemony. That's a realist objective that the United States pursued that didn't relate to liberalism. But nonetheless, liberal internationalism took a hit. And those elites that supported the war, and they included people like Hillary Clinton, they included people like Joe Biden when he was a senator, were less credible because of their support for the war. And the United States, as a credible international leader of liberal order, looked less credible. The second damage, the second hit was the 2008 financial crisis, which was kind of a kind of moment where what we might call the neoliberal underpinning of the liberal order became more evident, that it was really more about bankers and corporations using the international order to engage in transactions and doing deals, and that the everyday people, everyday working class people in industrial societies were not benefiting from this order. It looked more like a rich man's, and I think we do mean man, it's gendered in a certain way, a world. So that's number two. Number three, what I'll call the Chinese bet, the bet that was made in the 1990s under the Clinton administration and made later by President Bush and later by President Obama and by other leaders, that China could be brought into the liberal order and made a stakeholder. China, at the end of the Cold War, was still not yet embarked on its 3 decades of double-digit growth. So there was not a sense that China was a threat to the liberal order. It was really, the threat was not integrating it. And there was a kind of liberal view that that the capitalist, democratic, liberal system would, in some sense, engage China. China would find it would ever more increasingly want to reform itself in the direction of liberal democracy. And of course, this didn't happen. And under President Xi, China has gone the opposite direction to what some people call a kind of neo-totalitarian system where it's actually pioneering a new form of domination, authoritarian domination, using the kind of artificial intelligence, the kind of surveillance state, a kind of regime that challenges the liberal democratic world ever more profoundly. So these are damages that have made it harder for people to stand up and support the liberal international order. What I've done in my book to kind of take it just one or two steps further is that I've argued that these failures are real, but that in the larger context that when we debate what kind of international order do we want and what kind of international order do we want to pass on to our children, we want one that has features that would have to be described as liberal international, that have these features of openness, of institutions, of collective problem solving. And I remind my readers that while there are failures, and while I myself find myself to some extent under attack from the left and the right, from the right who argue that liberals are basically kind of idealist, naive theorists of interdependence, and on the left, liberals are attacked by those who argue that the liberal order has failed to deliver social justice. It's been maybe good for the rich countries, but it hasn't been good for Mexico. It hasn't been good for countries that are not at the G7, shall we say, level. And I take seriously that critique, but I argue that in the larger context of what are our choices, what do we want to do tomorrow, that we should acknowledge that there have also been accomplishments that are not accomplishments that are accomplishments that have been more widely shared than often expected or predicted. Think about, I call them the Super Six, the six big accomplishments of the liberal order. One is the opening of the world system, the world economy after World War II, GATT and the WTO, ushering in the most extensive growth period of world history after a period of mercantilism and the collapse of the world economy after 1929. So a framework for negotiating and building a more open world economy for mutual gain. Secondly, Germany and Japan, which were fascist states, were reintegrated into the world system as democracies. And not just democracies, but great powers that didn't have nuclear weapons. They were pioneering, and still today, under Merkel and Abe, they have been countries that have not said, we need to have nuclear weapons so that we can be traditional great powers. They have tried to set themselves up as new era great powers, one working within the EU and the other one working across the Pacific. Thirdly, Germany and France buried their differences and launched the European Union. I can't tell you how much more difficult the world would be today if Europe were divided. We take it for granted. We wake up every morning saying, man, we live in a world that is so fraught with problems. But imagine the world that we would wake up with if there was an arms race between Germany and France. I mean, we have taken off the table of problems the oldest countries in the world that have fought world wars. So we take that for granted, but we hope that the European Union can remain a kind of silent and active participant in building a more progressive world order. Fourthly, there's been this trilateral building out of institutions for managing problems. Bretton Woods, the WTO, the WHO, the International Energy Agency, the NPT. We have an incredible, unprecedented international society built around institutions that are there only because they solve problems. You didn't have those in the 19th century. You didn't have them in the 18th century. There's something new about this post-war American-led order that was friendly to the building of institutions. not all institutions, but many, many institutions. This is the 5 of my 6 super 6 reasons why this is not something we want to abandon, is that the liberal order has provided a kind of framework for newly rising states to attach themselves to institutions as they make very dangerous and difficult transitions to liberal democracy or to more modern industrial economies. And I go every summer to South Korea. And so South Korea is my best example of a country that started its career in the post-war order as a military dictatorship, but by the 1980s had turned itself into a democracy. It was a recipient of ODA, and by the end of the 20th century, the first decade of the 21st century, it was a benefactor of ODA. So it's a country that has been a huge beneficiary of a liberal international order. And if we had been in a world of imperial states or some post or pre-liberal order, the South Koreas of the world, and I would argue the Mexicos of the world and the Brazils of the world would be in a less positive position than they are. And then finally, the 6th this accomplishment is one that many Americans are not happy about, but China has had its best decades in 2,000 years as it has traded within this American order, double-digit growth, unprecedented, that was possible because it could tie itself to the international trade system, gain the benefits of technology transfer and exchange, extraordinary opportunistic use of China's use of the international order for its self-benefit. And of course, many of my American colleagues are like, why did we do that? You know, while people on the left are calling America an empire, if the United States is an empire, it's an empire that's not run very well because it's giving its money away to China. It has not grown during these decades when China has used the American system to rise up and be a peer competitor. And so on balance, I argue that it's better that China is in a kind of complex relationship with this existing order. We can talk about that, but it is quite remarkable that China has found a way to benefit and share the fruits of modernity in a way that in other kinds of international orders, it might not have been possible. So I'll just finish now, Humberto. I'll just have maybe 5 more minutes where I'll just say, well, what has gone wrong? And I've given you my first answer when I said that there have been these failures that have weakened the constituencies for liberal international order: the Iraq War, the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of China. But in a more deeper way, a deeper sense, I think that what happened is that liberal order lost its institutions and bargains. So during the Cold War, the liberal order was inside of a bipolar system. It was not a global system. Liberal order was a part of the world. It was what we used to call the free world. It was the non-communist world. And it was spread around in different continents, but it was in some sense, it had an identity as a set of countries that were in various ways tied to each other: institutions, alliances, partnerships. And it was like a club. And to be inside of it was to have benefits, like what you might call a mutual aid society. We're in it together. We get benefits, but we also have obligations and responsibilities. That's what clubs are. Not everybody can join a club. You join a club because you want to, and you get things from it, but you give things to it. And that sense of being, there's barriers to entry, and there's what I call a logic of conditionality. You're in it, but you need to behave in a certain way. The logic of conditionality. the EU is the most extreme example of this. If you're a fascist dictatorship, you can't join the EU. That's a club of democracies, although Poland and Hungary are testing that view. And the logic of conditionality is actually being negotiated now, because there now are efforts to block Hungary and Poland from gaining all the benefits of EU membership. So, but that's a logic of conditionality. And what the liberal order lost that logic of conditionality. That's why China, in some sense, was able to walk into the order, get what it wanted, but not to accept all the other, you might call human rights and social purposes that were part of liberal order. So that's where I will end things. I think that what the central task for liberal international order is to reimagine what an order might look like after kind of the American hegemonic era is over. Is there a constituency for an open rule-based order that isn't dominated by the US? Is there a possibility that a broader coalition of democracies could run international order? And I raise that as a hope, because I think that that's what Biden hopes. And this is my thinking. For those of you students who study international relations, there's a very famous book that was written about the breakdown of international order in the 1920s and 30s. It's called The 20 Years Crisis, written by a scholar named E.H. Carr. And E.H. Carr said the collapse of the 19th century world order and the failure of the League of Nations and the Versailles Settlement to create a liberal order after World War I was because of two reasons. One is that Britain was no longer hegemonic. It couldn't play that leadership role to keep the system going. And secondly, liberal democracy itself had come to an impasse because the 19th century version of liberal democracy was laissez-faire democracy that was not social democratic. And so in the 20s and 30s, the two conditions for a liberal order had been lost. A hegemonic state that was willing to be a friend of liberal international order, and a working model of liberal democracy. In many ways today, E.H. Carr is again right, that the US is not, at least although Biden is trying, cannot play that role it did after World War II of being the liberal state that will take on the responsibilities of keeping the system open and liberal. Secondly, we've lost the model of liberal democracy. Lots of people and countries aren't impressed by liberal democracy anymore. It looks pretty weak. They can't cope with a pandemic. They can't redistribute welfare. It's unequal. It's polarized. It's racist. So we're missing those two ingredients. But the problem is that whereas Britain was able to hand things off to the United States, who does the United States hand things off to? Well, you look around behind the United States, it's not another Britain, it's China. And China's model is not a model that most of us want. So if there is to be a third era that is not British and is not American, it's going to have to be a consortium of democracies, because the United States cannot hand leadership off to China, because you're not going to get a liberal democratic world. You're going to get the final ending of it. So my view is that just by necessity, the only way we're going to get to the end of the 21st century and still have something that looks sort of like a liberal democratic world order is if there is a coalition of states that keep it going. So that's how I'll end my remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, John, for a wonderful perspective on the present and future of the liberal world order. So now I let Mónica Serrano, Professor Serrano, to give her comment.
Thank you, Humberto. Thank you, José Ramón, again for the invitation. Hello, Professor Ikenberry. On my own behalf, welcome to Mexico, if it's only virtually to date. And what a great pleasure it is to being able to have this exchange with you. I thank you for this very stimulating talk, which is all the more timely, and I do hope I won't be considered too polemic if I say that Mexico is currently showing the symptoms of a democratic rollback, unfortunately. And I also hope that I will be understood when I say that I feel a bit like Elizabeth Harmon in the Queen's Gambit, really coming up against the Soviet master. In your presentation, as in your book, A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Crisis of Global Order, you have masterfully anticipated most of the questions, most of the concerns and doubts about the liberal international order. And it's very clear that one doesn't look to Professor Ikenberry for pessimism. The answers are there, the possible avenues to explore and to try are also in sight. The liberal international order, of course, can look very different from different perspectives. And in Mexico, in Spanish, its abbreviation is in fact LIO, which translates as mess. As you have rightly explained, this order advanced and prospered in close alliance with its domestic counterparts, and where the conditions in which in its domestic counterparts allowed for what Rogge has called embedded liberalism, created the conditions for a system, for a managed system of open trade based upon social protections. Your presentation clearly suggests that this order is shrinking rather than expanding. And as we know, debates about its crisis long preceded Trump and have changed course in relation to China. With China, as you put it in your own book, having shown a more constructive approach in the early stages of its involvement and integration in this order. Your call for a more restrained liberal international order is no doubt put forward for good reasons. And there is a welcome skepticism of the more crusader version of it. Yet one wonders whether the liberal international order can afford to be indifferent to the demands for freedom and human rights. We see what is going on in Myanmar today with people marching and demonstrating, showing banners with the R2P slogan. I refer to the conditions that Mexico is facing in relation to the rollback of democracy, not to mention the humanitarian crisis that the country is facing as a result of criminal violence and the efforts of states and successive governments to contain these threats. To what extent this more restrained, defensive liberal internationalism proposal that you seem to be putting forward in your book, less so in your talk today, amounts to putting a brave face on the increasing number of illiberal democracies. I do have a number of reactions to some of the ideas that are that inform your analysis of the evolution. You're very erudite, and I really welcome the historical approach to the evolution and the way in which this liberal international order has been able to cope with different challenges and troubles at different periods of times over two centuries, particularly having learned from the way in which the internationalists of the interwar period did not stagnate in a naive, innocent view, but were trying to grapple with the different challenges and the different and rapidly changing conditions that they faced. When I think of the way in which you explain in particular, the post-war phase of this order, the Second Cold War post-phase of this liberal international order, being a kind of inside order, a self-contained order, I cannot but help thinking that the conditions were then pretty benevolent. And paradoxically, as you rightly state, the Cold War system provided the structure for this kind of bubble to keep on floating, almost as an appendage of the international order in which the international liberal order flourished. With China, what I see is that it's not only that after the implosion of the Soviet Union, the liberal order expanded and globalized, it is also the fact that with China, as opposed as was the case with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the battle takes place on two fronts, both on the political and the economical front. And that makes the challenges perhaps even more difficult to handle and to manage. I do understand, and I also share your view about the way in which the liberal international order needs to be understood as an ecosystem that is needed for liberal democracies to survive, being as they are very fragile systems and creatures. But at the same time, I do see that as the international liberal order evolved and prospered, living as it did, marks and shaping the international order, it created serious dilemmas. And I can't help but think of my professor Adam Roberts when he said in relation to R2P and human rights, how the gradual evolution of human rights and the human rights system was perhaps a more perhaps a more, how could I say it, a more viable way of proceeding rather than the more crusade vision. In some interpretations of R2P, I happen to have a very different one, which sees the responsibility to protect us intimately connected with that evolution of human rights, and therefore sees less need of international intervention, because if human rights have developed internally and regionally, then the need for external intervention would reduce. So in this evolution, the international liberal order has faced and confronts numerous dilemmas. If it becomes too assertive, then it inevitably encourages pushbacks. But if it fails to respond, as we are seeing President Biden responding to the interference of Russia and Putin in the US elections, and referring to the assassinations that we have seen and witnessed of Russian citizens in Europe and elsewhere, as calling him, for all purposes, a killer. If it fails to react, then it, in a way, puts at risk that ecosystem upon which its survival depends. In terms of the breakdown of this embedded liberalism in your book, more than in your presentation again, you seem to suggest that this breakdown is somehow intimately associated with the globalization of the liberal international order. And yet, if we stop and think a bit, it is difficult not to see it as coming from within. In the end, the neoliberal agenda gathered force in countries like the US under Reagan and clearly in Britain under Thatcher. And it was only subsequently that it was exported, NAFTA being a very important template for the neoliberal expansion of the new version of international economic relations. So globalization may have then reinforced the shift away from embedded liberalism, but as many perhaps would argue, it was hardly the main propeller. In terms of the challenges that have accompanied the advance and the expansion of the international liberal order, I think what you say about as it became increasingly diverse and the number of players multiplied, clearly the administration, and you also made that clear in your presentation, the administration of the order became a major proposition. It's also clear that as new emerging powers rose, they perhaps not only demanded a voice and participation, but they also wanted to put forward their own views and their own interpretations of how these particular institutions, I'm thinking of the WTO and the way in which Brazil, among others, pushed for a reconsideration of trade rules and so on. So I see these challenges, but it seems to me that in your presentation, you have very clearly highlighted the 3-day Iraq war. 9/11 is also mentioned in your book. You also mentioned Iraq, the rise of China, and the third one escapes. I have to where's my notes.
Financial crisis.
Oh, the financial crisis, yes, the 2008 financial crisis, which is somehow linked to the crisis of the embedded liberalism, is probably its peak. But it seems to me that from a different perspective, and I will end my comments here with a question, from a different perspective, undoubtedly, the biggest challenge comes from the rise of China and how to accommodate China in the new international order. And while you clearly suggest this more restrained, modest version of international liberalism around this confederation of democracies that can offer an alternative to the non-liberal order that it's at offer with China, it seems to me that China is the big elephant in the room. And in that sense, how would your idea of a recrafted order would differ from those who call for a recreation of a kind of concert among big powers, where minimum agreed rules among different issues and different agendas, which may impinge upon impacting or not the statu quo, whether the statu quo can change or not, to what extent, what would be the scope of the agenda to consider and administer, how your vision of the liberal order differs or complements or supplements with those ideas of a new international order organized around visions of concert diplomacy, which is not different, by the way, from the way I saw from nuclear non-proliferation, the US-Soviet cooperation in nuclear deterrence and nuclear arms control. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Serrano, for your comment. So before giving the floor again back to Professor Ikenberry, I would like to remind the audience that you can send us your questions using the chat features on either YouTube or Zoom or Facebook Live. So I don't know if Professor Ikenberry would like to respond to some of the Professor Serrano's questions or comments.
Yes, thank you, Professor Serrano. Those were fantastic, and you were very kind to me, while you also raised very important questions. Maybe I'll start with your last question about China, because I do think you're right. The biggest challenge is China, and it's complicated. What you, in some sense, were asking is, in looking to the future, maybe it's better to accept the reality of a rising China and look for some kind of order that would be a kind of concert of powers, where the China and all the other major states would in some sense be on equal footing, and I guess it would be a kind of Westphalian system that would be global in scope, and with that hope that with all these states, these great powers, sort of in a kind of common position of leadership and management of the order, there would be a kind of stable system that would result. It's hard to resist that as a kind of on principle, because in some ways that's what we have today with the United Nations Security Council. And for those who want to create a kind of concert of great powers, I would say, and if China would like that, it would like to see itself as part of that system. I would say as an American that I would say to China, okay, let's do that, but you're going to have to accept Japan and India as permanent members of the UN Security Council. So China would have to give something to get something, and they are not going to do that. So I am very skeptical of a sort of 1815 concert of power, even if we thought we would want it if we could get it. But I want to raise a second problem with that, which is more, do we really want it even if we could get it? And that has to do with the view that a world that increasingly is tied to a kind of least common denominator of sovereignty and balance of power does not equip us to tackle problems of 21st century problems of environment and human rights issues and kind of recreating social welfare states so that modern industrial societies can have more stable and secure and just stratification of their societies. There is something that liberal democracies have in common that would be lost if they were simply to dissolve their projects of liberal order in favor of something that's simply a global Westphalian system. And I think it's even worse than that, in that I don't think, I think that the Chinese challenge is a kind of profound one that requires the liberal democracies to be operating at their very highest level in the face of really a Chinese project of building something that might be called a kind of an illiberal modernity project. Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, used the term modernity project as a term of art to identify kind of first order grand projects that come out of the modern era that are lots of assembled parts to economics, politics, and society. And there has been a kind of Western liberal democratic modernity project. China, I think 20 years ago, we thought, well, maybe they're also kind of reluctantly conceding that that's the only modernity project that's out there. But it looks increasingly like they are trying to build a separate kind of modernity project that really ties capitalism. It's really capitalism without liberalism and capitalism without democracy. And if we are also correct that the technologies of our new era, artificial intelligence, the way in which computers and telecommunications, all Chinese are on something called WeChat, which everybody does everything. They order their groceries, they call each other. It's all one system, and it's owned really by the government. I mean, it's unbelievably ripe for a kind of new age, kind of authoritarian, even totalitarian control. So I do think that I would not start with, can we stabilize relations with China? I think we should start with, can liberal democracies get their act together? And can we make our own societies better? Now, I tend to agree with the position of the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who's an old friend, who says that when you think about competition with China, it's not so much that we should try to undermine them or even contain them in the traditional sense, but to do better ourselves. It's like you're on a bicycle, they're on a bicycle. One thing is to take a stick and try to stick it into their tire or their wheel so that they will stop pedaling and fall over. That's not what I have in mind. It's really that we get better at pedaling our bicycle. So we pass them, not because we slowed them down, but we've made ourselves faster. And that kind of logic is what I have in mind. And I think it is a kind of collaborative logic for countries to develop a kind of shared agenda for how we want to organize the rules and institutions. China will want to organize cyberspace very differently than liberal democracies. They will want to organize the United Nations, peacekeeping, the IMF, global finance. If the Chinese yuan currency becomes the global currency, a million things follow in the wake of that will not be friendly to liberal democracy. So I think this is kind of a historical moment where we acknowledge our vulnerabilities and find a kind of path forward where as much as possible, but not in a kind of Cold War mode, organize ourselves to respond to China. And I've been kind of historically on the soft side of how to think about China. I've been what my colleagues call a panda hugger. That's a term of art. But so I think my credibility of being kind of reasonable is out there. But I do think that if we want to have a good relationship with China, you should do so from a position of strength. And the position of strength is a common front where a coalition of liberal democracies have some common working understanding of how they want to drive the reform agenda for international rules and institutions across many different areas. And if that common front has some coherence, it's actually better for China because there's a kind of coherent cleavage that can be the basis for dialogue. So I'll stop there, Humberto. I've got comments on other fronts here, particularly on R2P and Adam Roberts, who I share with you my affection for him as a fantastic figure at Oxford and who I have enjoyed many, many times while at Oxford as a intellectual companion.
Okay, thank you, John. We already have a few questions from the audience, so I will start reading them. So in fact, the first is from Professor José Ramón Cossío. And I think I will group together 3 questions because they have to do with more or less the same topic. So first is by Professor José Ramón Cossío, and he asks you, what do you think about the future of Mexico within the context of the tensions between the US and China? And there's also a question by Héctor Dorantes that is related to this. He says, what concerns me about liberalism is that in the new US-MCA deal, there's no technology transfer between Mexico and the US and Canada. Since there's a clear tension between the US and China, would Mexico become a new supply zone for the US? So it's also about the role of Mexico within this interaction between the US and China. And there is a third question that is connected to this, that is by Ruby Soto, and she asks, what would be the role of Mexico in the new international order? So I would leave it there.
I would like to hear from my colleagues about how they would like to see these relationships evolve going forward. I mean, the U.S. does have this new administration, and it's going to be spending a lot of time on China, but it's also going to be spending a lot of time on domestic economics, and some of this is not going to be good news for Mexico, in that Biden has 4 years. He's going to face either Trump again, or he's going to face somebody who's going to be Trumpian. So he's going to have to be kind of practical and pragmatic about how can he get the U.S. economy in as strong a position where he can keep the voters who kind of swing voters who could easily go the other direction. And so there's a kind of, it does lead to a little bit of what you might call economic nationalism. There's Buy America. Biden is not quite Obama, and certainly not Clinton, in that there isn't quite the unfettered argument about trade agreements and open trade. There's a little bit, not mercantilism, but there's a little bit more managed trade in the Democratic agenda. And that does mean it's going to be a little bit more difficult, I think, to have a kind of freewheeling negotiation with Mexico. So I just make that as my first point. I think on the other hand, I do think that Biden sees Mexico as a natural partner in this global system that he sees emerging. That Mexico and Canada are part of the kind of core of a kind of concentric circles of partners that hopefully will go south into Latin America and go out to Europe and go into East Asia. Maybe you can remind me, Mexico was part of the TPP proposal. And so that's another example where, in principle, Biden should be actively trying to establish this PPP that again ties Mexico, Canada, the United States, Chile to East Asia as a kind of alternative to China. But that there's inside of the Democratic coalition, on the left, there is a worry about those TPP trade agreements undermining worker rights and various kinds of labor standards inside of the American economy. So Biden is kind of caught between his geopolitical instincts, which are, we made a huge mistake in not ratifying TPP because that's the counterweight to China. China is everybody's first trade partner now. Japan, Korea, ASEAN, everybody has China as its main trade partner. All these countries used to have the United States as their trade partner. Now it's China. If China is not going to, if we want to prevent China from being the center of the world system, we have to create counterweights and alternatives. And those alternatives are not just geopolitical, they're also based on different values. But so that's the Biden impulse. But the tension is that he's limited to what he can do because of Congress, and not just on the right, but on the left. And so I think that's one area where U.S.-Mexico relations will be defined in that divide. There's a second divide where U.S.-Mexico relations will be defined, and that is on immigration. Biden is going to be in real trouble if he doesn't solve this border crisis. And that is primarily refugees and immigrants coming from Central America. And they're partly coming because they think Biden will be more friendly towards crossing the border than Trump was. And there may be something to that, but not as friendly as they may think. But the problems are even deeper than that, in that many of these people are leaving countries like Guatemala because of catastrophes in their economy caused by global warming. The tropical subsistence agriculture, which has sustained millions of people on the land in Central America, is under real long-term, permanent, irreversible threat, which is going to mean that the problems of refugee flows out of Central America is going to become greater, not less. So this is going to be a crisis that's going to grow. And it's, you have just incredible kind of environmental damage that is going to make this something that's not going to be easy to solve. But Biden, if we aren't going to get another return of Trump, which would not be good for U.S.-Mexican relations, he's going to have to look like he has a answer to the issues of refugees crossing the border. And I don't have an answer to that, but it entails investing more in countries like Guatemala that are going to need to find a solution so that their people do not feel like the only thing they can do is to leave their country with only their clothes on their back. They have nothing. They are the most vulnerable people out there in this hemisphere, and they don't have any answers to their vulnerabilities. So they're moving northward, and I do think that it's a big, deep problem, and that issue is going to be politically radioactive for Biden as the next election comes. So I think, the best, just finally on the broader picture, I do think that U.S.-China relations, there's a kind of upside to the downside. The upside is that U.S.-China relations should make the United States more attentive to its allies, because China could easily provide an alternative. So think about the vaccine sharing. China and Russia have been doing vaccine diplomacy with their Sputnik vaccine. Now, I'm not sure I would take the Sputnik vaccine, but in any case, I think the United States, as we were suggesting earlier, may be realizing that a lot of what will determine world politics in the 21st century is how do these powerful states act as providers of basic security, and China is going to try to be the new patron. And so if the United States wants to be back in the game, it's going to have to pay more attention to its allies, including its neighbors on its borders. So I think that there's a context there in which geopolitics gets factored into particular policy problems.
Okay, thank you, John. We have another question from Professor Celia Toro from El Colegio de México. She asks, if a liberal order is the way democracies organize the world, we need more democracies to support that kind of order. But democracies are not flourishing. In fact, they are being threatened today by populist and authoritarian systems. What to do?
Yeah, I wish I knew, and I would sell my advice for a good fee. That's a great question, and I'll try to make some answers. First of all, as I mentioned at the very beginning, democracies are deteriorating across the board. Old, rich democracies, young, poor democracies, democracies in the East, democracies in the South. There's been an extraordinary retrograde. And as I said, the Freedom House has just come out with its new report, and it's very depressing reading. 15 years in a row, the quality of democracy has deteriorated. More countries, in Mexico, you feel it. We feel it in the United States, and it's everywhere. Brazil, Turkey, Eastern European countries, the Philippines, India. How much more of India is a democracy today? So we're in this kind of retrograde period. I'll just make a couple points. One is, one thing that we know as political scientists is that democratization goes up and down in waves. This is something that Samuel Huntington, the famous Harvard professor, talked about the third wave of democratization in the 1980s after the Cold War. There was a second wave during the period of decolonization. There was the first wave after the Napoleonic Wars. Remarkably, in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century, we had something like 14 republics in North and South America. And one of the great stories of international relations is that the second Hague Conference in 1907 was the occasion for the United States and a dozen Latin American republics to join up to convince the Hague host states to invite countries based on being sovereign, on the basis of sovereign equality, which the new republics in Latin America were now able to identify themselves as states of that sort. And it created a coalition that went into 1907, the Hague Conference, which was the beginning of really the modern organization of the international system. So the US and Latin America have been kind of forerunners for the modern liberal order. It's also the case that during the period of the 1930s, when FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, came into office, he was very much focused on Latin America and the kind of multilateral possibilities for cooperation. And historians are now writing articles and books about how that vision of a kind of hemispheric multilateral system was a kind of template for post-war Bretton Woods era internationalism. So there's a lot here in the story of U.S. Latin American relations that's relevant to to the wider system. So Humberto, kind of tell me where you think I should go with this question.
I think that would be okay, because we have another question.
Maybe just one more thing about democracy, and that is that I guess this is what I wanted to say before I threw it back to you, that political scientists do have this view that leadership, democratic leadership of the global system matters, that in these waves, it mattered to have a kind of leading state that was dedicated to supporting liberal democratic transitions elsewhere around the world. There's an article in the American Political Science Review by one of my colleagues, Carlos Bosch, B-O-I-X, where he does a quantitative study of when democracy went up, when it went down, and he correlates that with, was there a leading state that was trying to provide a kind of congenial environment for countries that wanted to make democratic transitions? And there's a strong correlation. So I do think that it matters that the United States, that the European Union, that other countries show a kind of not just rhetorical support for liberal democracy, but provide a kind of international coalition that want to reward countries that are becoming more democratic and put pressure on them to not retrograde themselves any further. So the danger of democratic backsliding is so great, and what is so worrisome is that what the democratic backsliding that we're watching is not like the old democratic backsliding of military coups or generals taking over the presidential palace and establishing an authoritarian military rule, or even a kind of old 1930s era single party authoritarian state, like in Spain and other places. What's happening is this more incremental, insidious de-democraticization coming from, like you see in Orban in Hungary. It's taking command in a very subtle way, using constitutional rights and rules. So it's not a direct violation of the Constitution. It's changing rules so that you put your party loyalists in positions to change regulatory standards that put your opposition in a disadvantage, or voting rights and things like that. So it's going to be a struggle that has to be fought on all sorts of different fronts, because the Orbans of the world have figured out the quiet way to make it happen without triggering a huge social movement against it.
Oh, okay, so now I would like to read for you a question that is related to the previous one, that is by Beatriz Cepeda. She's a professor also from el Colegio de México. And she says, I find your idea of a consortium of democracies very stimulating. However, as Kindleberger noted, regime maintenance requires more than a commitment to certain values. It also calls for the willingness to assume the economic, military, and political cost of maintaining the regime or order. While I can easily identify a group of democracies who espouse liberal values, I find it more difficult to envisage who among them, be it individually or as a group, would be willing to carry the cost of maintaining the ILO. How do you think this could work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know specifically relating to the ILO. I think that I think the professor is absolutely correct that it's not just about shared values. There has to be real commitment to providing resources. You know, and each of these areas is different. I'm not quite sure about ILO, but but I'll take a couple other examples that are similar. On, you know, WHO, I think that you do have to have a leading state. I think the United States has to be back trying to work with other democracies to codify protocols about monitoring pandemic disease, so that authoritarian states can't close their system to what would otherwise be norms of transparency and mutual scientific best practice monitoring of laboratories and local outbreaks of disease. That's just a fundamental condition for a global system for coping with pandemic disease. And the U.S. withdrew from the WTO during the pandemic. Trump did that. That's extraordinary. Now Biden is back in, but what my point is that the professor is right. It's not just the U.S. should rejoin the WHO, but it's going to have to put its money where its mouth is. It's going to have to increase its contributions and it's already up until now been the biggest contributor to the WHO, but it's going to have to step up further, and it's going to have to work with other countries on the kind of these principles of international institutions. So I know some people are interested in geopolitics, but the topic we're talking about now is basically fundamentals of global governance. And what I think the professor is getting at is that there has to be leaders that work within these institutions, which are very decentralized. Each issue area has its own ecology, its own IOs, its own regime principles. But in each of these, you have to work on an ongoing basis to make sure that you secure best practices, transparency, accountability of decision makers, respect for civil society, scientific expertise, peer review. Those are 5, you might call principles of global governance that liberal democracies are more inclined to support than non-democracies, and that you have to have states with that are willing to, in effect, be part of the struggle over reform of international institutions to make sure that those principles are insinuated back into those institutions. So that's all I would say, that I agree with the professor. It's not just spouting values, it's using your influence because you are a leading contributor to an international institution to make sure that with those contributions, with your leadership, you're promoting the kind of reform that keeps these institutions operating in the way that we care about.
And so Professor Cepeda, the one who asked the previous question, added a comment. She says that by ILO, she meant International Liberal Order, not International Labor Organization.
Oh.
Sorry for the confusion, she says.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
well, that's a relief, because I was trying to figure out what to say about the ILO in this other sense, but I guess what I've said then would be responsive. Thank you.
Okay, and so we have another question. We have a question from Professor Nain Martinez, also from El Colegio de México. He says, one concern for some traditional allies of the US is its polarization and the implications for a reliable position. For instance, engaging in the reconstruction of multilateral institutions within the Biden administration, while there is a risk that the US position can have a radical change in 4 years. In your view, how can this factor influence the formation of the international coalition of democracies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. I am totally sympathetic to that question because I worry every day that this is a 4-year interlude. And I think that American friends and allies abroad have to protect themselves from that possibility. So I don't expect American friends and allies to simply say, okay, the Trump years are over, now we're back to the good times. Because I don't think that a self-interested state, whether it's Mexico or European states or Japan, can simply assume that the worst is over, because we are a very polarized country, and Biden won while the popular vote was great, the United States has this strange system of electoral college and protection of minority rights and geographic rights, the so-called state system, that makes it harder for the majority to actually secure its governance. And so while Biden won by a huge margin, several million votes, it's quite possible that a few thousand here and there could have made the difference. And so the next election, 2024, could flip it back. I don't think so. The underlying demographics of America are going to make it harder and harder for the Republican strategy to work, which is a strategy of restraining voting and making it more of a white people's vote. So I'm not of the view that we will flip back to a Trump, and I actually don't think Trump will run. And if he did run, I do think he would lose. But I share the view that the United States is not going to immediately be able to be credible when it goes out and talks about multilateralism and establishing its leadership again. I think people should be very skeptical of the United States. I think that the United States has, if not burned bridges, it's made itself very difficult to believe anymore. And I don't, it may not be permanent, but the damage may not be permanent, but the damage is definitely long-term. And I would welcome your views on that, because you have your own understanding of how you see and what you hear. But I think it's going to take a long time to rebuild kind of credibility and goodwill. I think that's absolutely, it's a very sad situation. But I do think that Biden is trying his best. I think he's the right person to be doing this. He's a very, I think he's an honest figure. I think he feels this very personally. He knows the nature of the problem. But again, it's his advisors, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, are I've known them like people, like I know my colleagues here in Princeton, and I know what they think, and I think it's a very they're very impressive figures. I would give them the keys to the American government anytime, and because I think they'll drive the system quite well. They know what they're doing. They have a kind of internationalism deep in their bones, but America it's got all these troubles that are deep: polarization, all this craziness that we thought had been kind of put back in the closet has been taken out again. And it's going to take a while to put it back in the closet.
And we have another question from Reinaldo Ortega, a professor from el Colegio de México. And he asks, could we go from a liberal democratic order into a social democratic order?
Well, I don't quite know what the term social democratic order means, so I have to kind of infer a little bit here. One point to make is that we were talking earlier, and Professor Serrano mentioned this in terms of embedded liberalism as kind of the kind of precondition for international order, liberal international order that has been kind of lost by the 1980s, the Reagan Thatcher period. You began to see the decline of embedded liberalism, which is what I think this person asking the question is when talking about social democratic order. In some sense, that's what embedded liberalism is. It's kind of the mixed system that it has this kind of Keynesian logic to it of government responsibility for stabilizing employment and supporting social welfare and the welfare state. And I think that was the genius of the post-war system, that there was enough of that in the system that people across the industrial world could see themselves trading and integrating, to some extent globalizing, because there was a kind of domestic system that would support it. And that got eroded. And you have people in all of our societies that are very much right on the margins, that have not seen their domestic systems, their domestic household income go up. One of the theorists that, if you really want to get depressed about the future of democracy, read the work by Robert Gordon, who's an economic historian at Northwestern University. And he looks at industrialism and capitalist development across 200 years. And he argues that what has allowed for liberal democracy to flourish is that there was an underlying waves of technology and technology innovation that had the effect of creating huge jumps in labor productivity. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, often it was associated with heavy industry and then more knowledge-intensive industry. And that created wealth effects and rising household income, that jobs that were still kind of, you might call them middle-class jobs, working-class jobs, were now allowing these people to have a stable rising incomes. And each generation from 1800 to 2000, every generation could assume that you were doing better than your parents, but your children were going to do better than you. And every generation through the 19th century and 20th century, with obviously setbacks because of war and depression, but every generation that then came back did better than the previous generation, and each generation to come would do better. We're now in a generation that my son who's a college student, his generation cannot expect to do better than my generation. And that has huge effects for how people think about progress, think about liberal democracy, think about the legitimacy of our societies. So I do think it's a huge issue, and we're going to have to somehow recreate a kind of social democracy, because that domestic foundation is necessary for the international foundation.
Okay. Thank you, John. I think I'm going to read just two more questions. One is from Gabriel Gonzalez. He asks, in what way the democratic alliance that you propose would differ from NATO? Should it need to be a more tight alliance like a confederation such as the European Union? Which countries would it need to include?
Well, yes, that's a great question. And I kind of have been wrestling with that myself. It's definitely not a NATO. It's more a loose grouping. It could be several different groupings. What I proposed in a foreign affairs review last summer was something called the D10 or the D12, which would be some set of countries. I guess you would say, you know, the G20 democracies, or some subset of them that would not simply be the old European Atlantic countries, but plus Japan, that's the G7, but would be a new configuration, much more inclusive. I would love for it to include South Korea and India in Asia, and Mexico and Brazil, and Canada, of course. But I'm not a architect really of this idea. I think the principles are there that I want to defend. I'm not sure the actual architecture. I have a long history of making proposals. Back in the 2006, 2007, my colleague, who was dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, Anne-Marie Slaughter, and I proposed something called a concert of democracies. And some other people proposed something called a league of democracies. And the questioner is talking about a confederation. And these are very old. There's a very old lineage of ideas that go all the way back to the 19th century, to various kinds of groupings, maybe even back to Immanuel Kant and the idea of a kind of consortium or federation of democracies. But I don't think it should be too formal, because that reinforces a kind of us versus them mentality towards China. And some countries would not want to be part of what would look like a direct confrontation of China. So softer is better, informal is better, kind of multi-dimensional is better. So you may be aware of, just last week, there was this effort of what was called a Quad network for East Asia, with the US, Japan, India, and Australia, the Quad, which is increasingly more ambitious as a kind of 4 countries that are nominally democratic, that want to work together, not formally to constrain China, but to offer some counterweight to China. And to, in particular, the proposal was to use that Quad to distribute COVID vaccine in Southeast Asia. So US would pay for it, India would produce it. India is a great pharmaceutical country, and Australia and Japan would distribute it. So that's a perfect example of a working coalition of countries that are partly driven by their shared values and strategic interests to work on a set of issues that are regional. So it doesn't have to be a single kind of global concert of democracies. It might be several different coalitions. And the more flexible, probably the better.
And there is a final question that I would like to read from Salima Mónica Cossens. She says, my regards to Professor Ikenberry. I am a big admirer of his work. And she asks, what is your opinion, and how should academia contribute to this liberal international ecosystem that you envision? She says, should we open our research to take on other geotemporalities that's the term she uses, that enable the creation of more inclusive theories and methodologies?
Yes, absolutely. This is very important. There's a role for academics who study international order to be open to kind of new imaginaries, new ways of visualizing the world, new ways of thinking about coalitions. The future is really going to be about alignments, coalitions, partnerships, and a deeper kind of imaginaries, to use Robert Cox's term, of kind of visions of how we think about the world that go beyond the Westphalian vision or even the old American-led liberal vision, that there will be new ones that will, and they will be coming out of various countries. I'll just give one example. At Princeton, I am running a new project called Reimagining World Order, and it's housed in our Princeton Institute for International Studies, and I have scholars from around the world who are kind of associates of it, European, Asian, and Latin American. I don't have an African advisor, but I've got people who are interested in world order debates from other parts of the world. And we're kind of trying to work through new visions. The other point I'll make is that many of the old theories of international order are just not going to make it in the 21st century. Realism is very, realism, which is the great, most popular theory of international order based on power and balance of power, is basically blind to these new problems because they're not state problems based on power and order. They're based on modernity and the nature of interdependence. And realism does not give us an answer to managing global cascades of interdependence. Neither do I would argue the kind of left-wing neo-colonial or anti-colonial or post-colonial theories that are really critiques of the West, showing that the West is built on racism and imperialism. All of that is true. The West is and has been racist and imperialist, and there's a reckoning that has to occur. We've taken Woodrow Wilson's name off of my building because he was a racist, but he also was a globalist. He understood that we had to go beyond the balance of power, and collective security is which he helped bring to the world, is something that the world needs. So we're all of us have dirty hands, but we can take down statues and we can take names off buildings and we can be more enlightened, but that's not enough to just simply destroy and undermine the legitimacy of our old institutions. I can do that just as well as anybody else can do that. It's a full-time job for some of my colleagues who are critics of liberalism, and liberalism is a very easy target because the level of hypocrisy is fantastic. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, after you've delegitimated core institutions of Western liberal democracy, then you have to say, what the hell do we do now? If all of your institutions are delegitimated by the critique, what's left? Social movements of woke students? I'm afraid that's just not going to be enough. We need something. And so I do think that we have to be both critical and constructive. And I think universities can help be kind of new era thinkers of the global, new imaginaries. I hope to run a summer seminar with colleagues on global thinking. So, that kind of work of opening our minds to new ideas and constructive ideas is where the future lies.
So, well, there are a few more questions, but we no longer have time, unfortunately. I don't know if Professor Serrano, Professor Cossío, Professor Prudhomme would like to add something just to end our session.
Just that it has been fantastically illuminating, that there are lots of questions and answers that need to be shared and exchanged, and that I would really hope that this is the first step towards having a deeper conversation. What you say about Latin America in your book and what you have mentioned in your presentation and your comments is fundamentally important. The contribution of our countries to that liberal global architecture, whether it's in non-proliferation, in human rights, and in a more negative light in terms of the international drug control regime that needs to be reformed. I think this is the beginning. I very much hope of a longer and deeper conversation.
Thank you
Yes,
so much.
well,
Thank you.
I would like to thank Professor Ikenberry for his very, very interesting presentation, and for all the ideas that we are left to think about. I would like to yes, and I would love to see a new and a stronger liberal order, but at the same time, and you made it clear, there are a lot of obstacles that we would have to surmount in order to have a strong new liberal order. I would like to thank also Professor Serrano for her comments, very interesting comments, and Professor José Ramón Cossío and Humberto Beck for the organization of this conference. Thank you to all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ikenberry and Professor Serrano, again, for your participation. I think it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Look forward to, I hope we can see each other in person.
Hopefully, yes.
In the not too distant future.
Yes.
We will get through this. We will get through this. Thank you so much. You've been so gracious.
Thank you. Thank you much. Thank you to
Thank you very much.
And see you in the next session of the seminar. Goodbye.
Gracias, Mónica.
Muchas gracias, Mónica. Gracias, Jean-François.
No, gracias, Humberto. Muy interesante tu comentario, Mónica.
Estuvo bien, estuvo muy bien. Sí.
Y en el fondo es, ¿qué?
Estaba tentada a decirle, pero dije no, porque en general los gringos no tienen mucho sentido del humor, que para poder leer su libro había tenido que recurrir a una de estas websites de las rusas.
Para tener acceso al libro.
Que es uno de los principios que están en la base
del orden internacional liberal.
La propiedad, el respeto a la propiedad. Quería hilarlo con lo de las vacunas, pero dije no, entre que los gringos no tienen sentido del humor para esas cosas y el ministro Cossío a lo mejor también considera que no es apropiado, mejor
ahora,
no hago la confesión.
Ahora, digamos, el proyecto es muy interesante, pero 4 años en las condiciones actuales.
Es muy poquito.
Es muy poco tiempo.
Sí, a ver.
Es muy poco tiempo.
Sí, puede ser un paréntesis nada más, ¿no?
Sí.
No, y además los dilemas, o sea, necesitarías una Europa mucho más consolidada y ese ha sido el dilema eterno de Estados Unidos, que cuando Europa da pasos para integrarse, mete el pie. Entonces, ¿cuáles son las democracias con las que quiere hacer este club? De alguna manera, ya no quise decirle, pero en el libro, por ejemplo, dice que un orden westfaliano es un orden que no infringe y no atenta contra la soberanía. Eso no es cierto. El concierto puede acordar reglas que infringen en la soberanía. Los acuerdos de no proliferación, los acuerdos de control de armas, los acuerdos que tienen que ver con la Organización Mundial de la Salud, miles de acuerdos infringen en la soberanía, pero no de la manera en la que acuerdos que tienen que ver con derechos humanos o democracia atentan contra la relación entre las autoridades estatales y los ciudadanos. Es ahí donde ponen. Entonces, yo creo que hay la necesidad de pensar, por eso le traté de insistir en el tema del concierto, y yo creo que le falta profundizar en el conocimiento de China, porque no estoy tan segura, por ejemplo, que en temas como peacekeeping, China haya sido tan poco constructiva como la pinta. Habría que ver en dónde sí y en dónde no, y hay ahí la necesidad de profundizar en el conocimiento de China, creo yo.
Bueno, hay una reunión que está terminando ahora en Anchorage, ¿no? En Alaska, entre la administración de representantes de Biden y representantes del gobierno chino. Lo único que podemos decir, como él mencionaba antes que te conectaras, Mónica, es que el intercambio ha sido muy vigoroso entre
no, ha sido tenso.
los chinos y los...
No, y los auspicios no son buenos. Sí. Creo que te comenté que a mí me tocó verlos. Ellos financiaron completamente el edificio del Parlatino en Panamá.
Okay.
Fui invitada a dar una conferencia y aparecieron cuando había una funcionaria europea que iba a hablar, una embajadora que iba a hablar sobre derechos humanos de la manera más irrespetuosa, hablando, riéndose. No aparecieron a ninguna otra sesión más que a esa. Entonces, que los auspicios no son buenos, no son buenos. Pero que hay que lidiar con...
no, desde
no
luego.
sé cómo.
Bueno.
Pero muchísimas gracias de nuevo, Humberto.
Gracias otra vez, Mónica.
Gracias. Humberto, muchas, sí.
Te mandé una disculpa, pero no estoy segura que la hayas recibido para el seminario de Luisi.
No, no recibí.
¿No la recibiste?
No.
Porque mi teléfono se está llenando todo el tiempo y me está dando mucha lata. La memoria se me bloquea, pero entonces mandé el correo y no supe si salió. Me daba en la pantalla pero bueno, una disculpa.
No lo recibí, pero bueno, estuvo muy bien y tendremos otras oportunidades. Bueno, Humberto, otra vez.
Mil gracias de nuevo, Humberto.
Gracias, nos vemos. Hasta luego.